Obese daughter was given to a slave and found in him the voice she was denied. What kind of father trades his own daughter as punishment? Not to a husband, not to a family, to a man once enslaved, now barely free because she ate too much, because she didn't look like the girl he wanted to show the world. But what if the man she was given to didn't look at her with disgust, didn't want to change her? What if through silence, sweat, and small acts of care he gave her something her own blood never did? In today's story, a girl discarded like shame finds strength not in revenge, but in quiet resistance. She learns to read, to write, to teach, and in doing so, redefines what it means to be seen. This isn't just a Western drama. It's a tale about justice born in dust, of kindness without promises, and of voices reclaimed in places where they were once silent. Comment below the moment that moved you most. And if you believe in stories that heal and awaken, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. Now then, let's begin. The voice she never had. Her name was Livia, but for most of her life, it wasn't spoken with love, only with shame, or worse, silent. She was the daughter of a man who valued legacy over love, appearances over presence. To him, her body was a stain on the family name, a walking proof that some daughters grow wrong. Too soft, too large, too loud without saying anything at all. When the time came, she wasn't married off. She was given, as casually as someone trades a piece of land or a mule, given to a man the world called freed, though his wrists still remembered the weight of iron. No protest was made. No one wept. No one stopped it. There was only her standing still, a girl in a pale dress with hands too empty and a name too heavy to carry alone. He took her without ceremony, without cruelty, without interest even. Just a nod, a space made for her in the back of a wagon. No one told her where they were going. No one asked if she wanted to. But what surprised her wasn't the silence. It was that, for the first time, someone wasn't filling that silence with judgment. He didn't speak to her like a burden. He didn't speak at all. And yet, in that stillness, something unfamiliar bloomed: respect. Not the kind given to titles or wealth. The kind that comes from seeing someone not as a symbol, but as a soul. Her name, her shame, her start. They named her Livia. Not Olivia. Not Liv. Just Livia. Simple, elegant, soft on the tongue. But it never sounded like that when it came from her father's mouth, when he even used it at all. Most days, she was her, or the girl, or when the whispers got cruel, the burden. Growing up in the Cashin estate, Livia learned early that her body was something to apologize for. Not because it failed her, but because it embarrassed others. Her mother, delicate and sharp like fine glass, died before Livia turned 10. There were no tearful goodbyes, no lullabies left behind, just the echo of absence and a father who replaced grief with protocol. Her only balm in those years was Aunt Rosamond, who never raised her voice and never lowered her eyes when Livia entered the room. On her 12th birthday, Rosamond gifted her a handkerchief. The stitching was uneven, but on it was her name, Livia, embroidered in a soft, slanting thread. "So you don't forget," Rosamond had said. "So you know who you are, even when others don't." Back then, Livia didn't understand why she would ever need to be reminded. But that handkerchief ended up tucked beneath her pillow every night like a secret map to a country no one else believed in. Puberty didn't arrive gently. Her body expanded in places that made maids cluck their tongues and tutors sigh in visible disappointment. Her father never yelled. He didn't need to. His silence during meals was louder than fists. He would simply watch her chew as if it offended him. And when guests joked softly, always softly, about her robust appetite, he'd smile with thin lips and thinner patience. She tried to disappear in her own skin, smiled less, spoke quieter, ate slower. Even breathing felt like taking up too much space. And then came the day she was sent away. There was no trial, no scene, just a decision made behind closed doors, and then a command: take her. She was handed off to a man she'd never seen before, a man with wind-beaten skin and eyes like burnt cedar. His name, she later learned, was Silas. He didn't speak much. That first night, he built her a fire and left her alone. She didn't sleep. Her mind spun with questions. Was this punishment? Was he dangerous? Was she going to be sold? By the third night, she was too sick to pretend anymore. The fever hit hard and fast. She remembers flashes of light, a cool cloth on her forehead, a bowl pressed to her lips. And then, in the haze, his voice, "Livia," he said. "Sit up. You need to eat." It was the way he said it. No warning, no pity, just her name, like it belonged to her, like it meant something, like he didn't need to shrink it or reshape it or spit it out like a curse. And that's when the questions began, not the ones about where she was or why he hadn't hurt her, but deeper ones. Questions like, what does it mean when someone uses your name without asking for anything? What does it mean when someone sees you without needing to fix you? She remembered the handkerchief. The stitches had started to fray at the corners, but the name was still there, still hers. Maybe Rosamond had known all along that the greatest theft wasn't what people took from you, it was what they made you forget was already yours. She began to listen for her name the way a lost child listens for a mother's call in a crowded place, not out of entitlement, but longing. And every time Silas used it, it chipped away at the crust of silence she'd built around herself. He never shortened it, never softened it, never made it smaller, even when she did. And somehow, that mattered more than all the kindness she'd ever been denied. They traveled quietly across dry lands and brittle grass, passing towns that looked through her and people who only saw what her body could not hide. In those places, she shrank again, shoulders tight, eyes down. But then Silas would say something like, "Livia, this road's rough. Take the other side." And the world would briefly expand around her. Like her name created a space she was allowed to occupy. It was disorienting to be called by name and not be followed by a request, a rebuke, a sigh of disappointment. Just a name, spoken and let go like a kite with no string. Once, when they stopped for rest near a creek, he asked, "What does your name mean?" She paused, unsure. No one had ever asked. "I think. My mother said it was from a Latin poem," she replied. "But I don't remember which one." "You don't need to know the poem," he said, half smiling. "You just need to remember you're not what they called you." And just like that, her throat tightened because he knew, somehow, without ever hearing the names they threw at her: cow, burden, disgrace. He knew. He knew the weight of being reduced to something less than human, of carrying a body the world used as proof that you didn't belong. He never asked her what happened back in the estate, never asked why her wrists were bruised or why she flinched at the sound of metal latches. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was permission. Permission to speak when ready or never at all. That night, under a sky freckled with stars, Livia lay on a bed of pine and asked herself a question she'd never dared say out loud. If someone calls you by name enough times, can it stitch you back together? In her dreams, her name floated above her, untangled from shame, glowing like a lantern someone had left on for her in the dark. And for the first time in years, she didn't dream of running away. She dreamed of staying, not in a place, but in a name. The next morning, she woke before the fire had dimmed, its glow brushing the edge of Silas's coat where he sat carving something into a piece of wood. She sat up slowly, unsure if sleep had tricked her into imagining it all. "Morning, Livia," he said, not looking up. And there it was again. That small act, that simple acknowledgement that didn't demand anything back. She didn't respond right away, but she watched him, really watched him, and something inside her, long folded into silence, breathed. Her name was still her, and somehow that was enough to begin again. The gentle hands of a stranger. She fell ill on the fourth night. It crept in slow, first the chills, then the heat that gripped her spine like iron. Livia tried to hide it. Old habits, hard to break. Weakness was never something she'd been allowed. You got sick, you hid it, you bled, you cleaned it, you cried, you faced the mirror and swallowed it. But by nightfall, her body gave in. Shivers turned to convulsions. Her breath came in bursts, and when she opened her eyes, the world tilted, spinning shadows, floating flames. She thought she might be dying, and the strangest part was she wasn't afraid, at least not of the fever. She was afraid of waking up alone. She didn't. Silas didn't speak much that night. He didn't say, "It'll be okay," or "You're going to make it." He didn't offer reassurances in a voice that never asked for permission. Instead, he built the fire higher, slowly, methodically. He soaked a rag and placed it on her forehead, then wiped it dry and did it again. He held a bowl in one hand and nudged her lips with a wooden spoon in the other. Broth salted, smoky, warm. She barely swallowed, but he kept feeding. Not urgently, not impatiently, just steadily. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to care for a girl who'd been dropped at his door with no reason, no explanation. And when she moaned or muttered nonsense in her haze, he didn't flinch, didn't sigh. He just stayed, in the silence, all through the night. When the fever finally broke, she opened her eyes to find him sitting nearby, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. His back was straight, his face unreadable. It was almost like she wasn't there except for the steaming bowl at her side, and the folded blanket now draped across her feet. "Why?" she whispered, voice raw. He looked over, blinked once, then turned back to his knife. "You needed care." "No," she croaked. "Why haven't you—" She stopped herself, but the rest hung in the air. "Why haven't you hit me, hurt me, taken anything?" He didn't answer, just reached for the bowl and set it in her lap. "Eat what you can." There was no gentleness in his tone, but there was no cruelty either, and that was what terrified her most. Because she knew cruelty. It had shape and edge and volume. But this quiet, durable mercy, it was unfamiliar, disarming. She had braced herself for the worst, had armored her mind, her words, her skin. But what do you do with a kindness that asks nothing in return? What armor do you wear when the sword never comes? That night, as she pretended to sleep, she felt a tremble rise in her chest, not from the fever, but from a sensation far more dangerous: safety. She wanted to cry but didn't trust the tears. She wanted to say thank you but didn't trust her voice. So she lay still, eyes closed, letting the silence between them stretch wide enough to fit her disbelief. And for the first time, she understood that some of the deepest wounds aren't reopened by violence, but by gentleness. Because when someone treats you like you matter, when they care for you without agenda, it doesn't just heal. It shatters. It breaks the dam you've spent your whole life building. Celis never touched her skin more than necessary, never hovered, never stared. He didn't ask her to explain who she was or where she came from. But when he brought her water in the morning, he knelt beside her, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You're not a burden here." Just that. No justification. No apology. And it was then, at that quiet camp, in the middle of nowhere, with dust in her hair and firelight dancing on her blanket, that Livia realized she had never, in her entire life, been nursed through sickness without being made to pay for it. She didn't know what that meant yet, but it made her want to get better. Livia began to watch him not out of suspicion, but with the cautious curiosity of someone relearning what safety might look like. Celis moved through the day with the silence of someone who had long ago learned not to announce his presence. He didn't hum or whistle. When he spoke, it was only when necessary, and always in full sentences, never half words like most men. There was no loudness in him, but neither was there hesitation. He made fires without smoke. He cleaned his tools like he respected them. He cooked meals as if someone might actually enjoy them. It unnerved her, because she'd grown up with noise, not shouting but sharpness, expectations that snapped like twigs underfoot. Women who whispered judgment behind fans. Men who sized her up like a merchant inspects damaged goods. Nothing in her world had prepared her for someone like him, who did not flinch when she winced, who did not demand when she paused, who did not look at her like she owed him something just for being kept alive. And yet, he knew things. like when to add mint to the broth to ease her nausea, or how to press herbs against her temple to cool her head. He didn't explain how he knew, didn't boast, but his hands dark, calloused, broad moved with the precision of someone who had learned to treat pain seriously. One afternoon, when the fever had passed and her voice returned, she asked, "Why do you know so much about healing?" He didn't answer right away, just stirred the pot in silence. Then he said, "Pain teaches you where things break. Healing teaches you where they don't." She didn't ask again. Later that night, while lying beneath the stars, she turned her head toward him and said, "I was waiting for the cruelty. Celis didn't blink. I thought you'd, I don't know, demand something, hurt me eventually. Men like you don't get handed girls like me unless there's something expected in return." He didn't look insulted, just tired. Then, after a long silence, he said, "That's how they taught you to measure men." She hesitated. "Isn't that how the world works?" "No," he said quietly. "It's just how broken people try to make it work." Those words stayed with her long after the fire had died. She found herself turning them over like stones in her hand, wondering what other truths might live beneath the assumptions she'd carried all her life. Perhaps not all gentleness had a price. Perhaps not all strangers were dangerous. Perhaps the hands that held the deepest power were the ones that never closed into fists. The deal that unmade her. It was a chance overhearing. They had stopped near a dusty trading post for supplies, salt, oats, lamp oil. Livia stayed near the wagon, wrapped in her shawl, watching the heat ripple off the ground. Celis stepped inside to barter. She wasn't trying to listen, but two men, drunk on mid-morning whiskey, stood talking just within earshot. "You hear about that girl?" one said. "The Cashin girl. Big one. Sent her off with a slave like she was cattle." The other laughed. "Didn't even wait till she was married off first. Just said, 'Keep her for 6 weeks. If you don't want her, throw her back, like a broken horse.'" Livia didn't breathe. The words landed not like arrows, but hammers. Slow, deliberate, crushing. 6 weeks. Not a lifetime. Not even a season. Just long enough for someone to decide if she was worth the trouble. Long enough to be tested, tried, and if deemed unworthy, discarded. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees weakened, not from sickness, but from the humiliation of it. That's what she'd been. A wager, a passing deal between men. She didn't wait for Celis to return. She walked behind the wagon, sat in the dirt, and folded her arms around herself, willing the world to stop spinning. He had known. That's what made it worse. He had known from the beginning what she was, what the terms were. And still, he had fed her, watched over her, spoke her name like it mattered, not because it did, but because he chose to pretend it did. The betrayal didn't come with shouting. It came with silence, the kind that unravels everything you've just begun to believe. When he came back, she didn't look at him, not during the ride, not at dinner, not by the fire. That night, as they sat with the stars high above, he finally said, "You heard them." She didn't answer. "I was told what the terms were." "Yes." Her jaw clenched. "And you agreed?" He looked into the fire. "I agreed to take you, not to break you." She laughed, bitter. "That wasn't part of the deal, was it?" "No," he said, quiet. But neither was kindness. She stood abruptly, the blanket falling from her lap. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up. "Would it have changed what I did?" She didn't know. That was the worst part. She didn't know what would have been better, being treated like nothing with full honesty, or being treated with dignity based on a lie. "You could have just let me go," she whispered. "You think you were mine to give away?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "You think I had power in that deal? I was just the wall they leaned you against." Silence stretched between them, not empty but overfull. And in that silence, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't angry because she was betrayed. She was angry because she had started to believe she mattered. And now, that belief felt like the cruelest trick of all. She walked away from the fire that night, not out of fear but because her shame had grown teeth, and it bit at her with every step. She wanted to scream, not at Celis, at the world, at the father who had weighed her like wheat, measured her worth in silence, and bartered her as if she were a coin he could afford to lose. She wanted to burn the contract, even if it was never written, but there was no paper, no ink, just spoken words and unspoken consent. The next morning, she woke early, packed her things in silence. Celis offered her water. She didn't take it. Not yet, because somewhere inside her, a voice had gone quiet. The voice that had started to whisper, "Maybe you're more than this." And now, she wasn't sure it would ever come back. Days passed, and the silence between them thickened like mist, heavy, hard to move through. They traveled without words, but every step forward felt like they were carrying the weight of all the ones unspoken behind them. Livia didn't cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because even her tears felt like they would betray something she hadn't figured out how to name. Rage, shame, heartbreak, it all blurred. But there was one thing she couldn't shake. He had still been kind, and that, somehow, made everything worse. If Celis had been cruel, if he had treated her like property, like the deal suggested, then she could have hated him freely. But he hadn't. He had treated her like a human being, like more than that, and now she didn't know where to put that kindness. It no longer felt like mercy. It felt like a mirror she hadn't asked to see herself in. One evening, while gathering firewood, she heard footsteps behind her, her body tensed, instinctively. But when she turned, it was him. "I'll stay on the other side of camp tonight," he said. "If that's what you want." She didn't respond, but he didn't expect her to. Before walking away, he said, "No matter what your father said, you were never his to give." She stood in the quiet long after he left, wind tugging at the edges of her shawl. Those words didn't fix anything, but they did something else. They named the wound, and sometimes naming it is the first way it stops bleeding. Later that night, she sat alone by the fire, tracing the seam of her coat with one finger. It had once belonged to her mother. She hadn't worn it since leaving, but now it wrapped around her shoulders like memory. Her mother had called her "my brave little girl" once. Not because she had fought, but because she had chosen silence over cruelty, stillness over violence. She had endured. Maybe bravery wasn't in the fighting. Maybe it was in the choosing to still be gentle, even when the world told you not to be. In the distance, she saw Celis back turned, head bowed, not watching her, not asking for anything, just being. And that image stayed with her, carved into her mind. The man who knew the terms, who could have taken everything and didn't, who had every reason to play his role in the game, and instead refused to play at all. That night, before crawling into her bedroll, she whispered not to him, not even to herself, but to the dark. "I wasn't the wager." She didn't know if it was true. Not yet. But it was the first thing she'd said aloud in days that didn't taste like ash. What he didn't say said everything. Celis didn't explain. He didn't justify the terms of the deal, or speak of what it meant to be part of an arrangement neither of them had chosen. He simply adjusted the perimeter of his presence like a man rearranging stones in a stream so the current might flow more gently. He moved his bedding a few paces farther from the fire, left food nearer her side of the wagon so she could take it when she was ready. He still watched for danger, still sharpened his knives each morning, but something had shifted, subtle but real. And in that quiet shift, she felt something strange, relief, because words can wound, but they can also crowd. And right now, her spirit needed room. A few days later, he returned from the outpost carrying a satchel with some dried apricots, new stitching thread, and a book worn, frayed, and covered in dust. He didn't hand it to her, just set it gently on the overturned crate near her seat by the fire. She noticed it before he even walked away. The spine was cracked, the pages uneven. She picked it up carefully, thumbing through the brittle paper. It wasn't a storybook, no grand tales or romantic poem, just an old almanac filled with crop cycles, moon phases, and scattered aphorisms printed in old serif type. Still, on the inside cover, someone had written out the alphabet in faint, childish script. She stared at the letters. A, B, C, D. Her heartbeat ticked behind her ribs like it was waiting. That night, after he had fallen asleep, she took a stick and began to trace the letters into the dirt beside the fire. She had never learned to read. Girls like her weren't taught. What for? Her job was to marry well, bear quietly, and never ask for meaning in a world that had already decided what she was. But here, in the stillness of a desert night, she found herself mouthing the letters like a prayer, not to God but to herself. And she wasn't alone. Each morning, the book would be moved a little closer to her place. Each evening, a stick of charcoal would appear, laid beside the fire. She never saw him put it there, but she knew it was him. When she finally asked softly how to write the word water, he didn't answer with words. He crouched beside her, drew 4 letters into the dirt, then stood and walked away. No praise, no lesson, just a gift, knowledge without transaction. It was the first time she had ever learned something where success wasn't measured by obedience. Soon, she began copying words on scraps of paper, practicing until her fingers cramped. She stumbled often letters reversed, spacing wrong, but she kept going. And he never corrected her unless she asked. Once, she caught him watching, not hovering, just watching. Their eyes met. "I want to write my name," she said. He nodded. "Then start there." It took days. She started with just L, then Lee. The rest followed slowly, the letters uncertain like fawns taking first steps. But then, one afternoon, under the pale sun of a winter sky, she wrote it fully, completely. Livia. She stared at it, breath caught, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. She walked over to Celis, handed him the slip of paper. He looked down at it, then up at her. He didn't smile wide, didn't clap, just met her eyes, nodded once, and said, "That's yours now." Aye. Then he turned back to the stew pot like nothing had happened. But everything had, because that one nod held more weight than any applause. It said, "I see you. I know how hard you worked. You don't need me to tell you what you already feel." That night, she couldn't sleep, not from worry, but from wonder. All her life, she had waited for someone to rescue her with words, with declarations of worth. But what if the real rescue was quieter? What if it came from someone giving you the space to rescue yourself? She watched the stars flicker above the tent cloth, then turned to see his shape in the distance, silent, steady, real. He hadn't made her feel smaller to feel powerful. He hadn't tried to save her to be the hero. He just stayed. And sometimes, staying is the most radical act of love there is. The next morning, Livia woke to find the book open to a page she hadn't reached yet. A tiny branch pinned it down, an unspoken invitation. She glanced at Celis, who was grinding herbs nearby, not looking her way. But she knew. He had opened it for her. Inside was a proverb written in thick, uneven letters. "A tree grows silently, so does strength." She ran her fingers over the words, half smiling. That day, she did more than copy letters. She asked for meaning, why certain letters made certain sounds, why read could mean something different depending on the tense. Celis explained patiently, but always left her to discover the patterns herself. And slowly, reading stopped being a task. It became a path, a thread back to herself. With each word she deciphered, her posture changed, shoulders drawn less tightly, jaw unclenched. She had been taught to shrink, to apologize for her presence. But now, she was taking up space in the world, even if only on paper. One night, when the fire was down to embers, she whispered across the dark, "I didn't know it would feel like this." Celis turned slightly. "Like what?" "Like, I matter, because I know something." He didn't answer right away, then said, "You always mattered. You just didn't have the words for it." She swallowed, throat tight. No one had ever said that to her before. That she mattered, not for how she looked, or who her father was, or what usefulness she had. Just for being. She didn't know what to do with that sentence, so she tucked it away like a seed she'd plant later, when she felt strong enough to believe it. As days passed, She began collecting discarded pages from town newspapers, ledgers, even candy wrappers. Anything with print. She'd sit by the fire in the evenings, sounding out headlines, laughing when they made no sense. Once, she came across an advertisement for a traveling preacher who promised redemption for all sinners. She shook her head, amused. "What?" Celis asked, glancing over. She held it up. "You think he means me?" Celis smiled. "I think you've done your own redeeming." The words landed like warmth after rain. That night, she wrote something new. Not just her name, but a full sentence. "I am not a burden." She showed it to Celis. This time, he didn't just nod. He touched the corner of the paper with one finger, as if anchoring it to the earth. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not arrogance. Not vanity. But quiet, rooted pride. She had earned each letter. She had carved her way into meaning, not by being told, but by discovering. Not by being saved, but by being believed in. Later that week, they passed through a village where a group of children played near a schoolhouse. Livia stopped to watch. One little girl struggled to sound out her own name, tongue tripping over the syllables. The teacher looked frustrated. The girl's eyes dropped. Without thinking, Livia stepped forward. "Catherine," she said gently. "That's your name, right?" The girl nodded, blinking. Livia knelt beside her, took a stick, and wrote the letters slowly in the dust. "Katherine. That's you." The girl smiled, a hesitant, amazed thing. And in that small moment, Livia saw a reflection of herself, not as the shamed girl traded for silence, but as someone who could give voice to others. She stood, heart full. Celis met her eyes from across the square. There was pride there, not the kind that celebrates winning, but the kind that honors rising. That night, she sat by the fire and added a line to her journal. "I helped someone say her name. No one had to know. No one had to witness it. But she did. And that was enough." The classroom with no map. It began with a single child standing at the edge of their camp, not dressed in fine clothes, not carrying any pride, just ragged shoes and a gaze that trembled between fear and hope. He looked at the tattered book in Livia's hands as if it were an artifact too precious to touch. "Can I hold it?" he asked in a soft voice. She paused, then silently extended the book, letting him cradle it as though it were a fragile bird. He didn't open it, just sat quietly, holding its weight, as if owning a promise the world had never offered him before. By dawn, there were 2 children, then 3. Within days, the group grew to 8, clustered around her tent like saplings seeking sun. They came barefoot, dusty, carrying nothing but the need for something new, a sound, a word, a meaning. So she taught them. There were no chalkboards, no slates, no printed guides, just earth, sticks, scraps of charcoal, and her voice. She taught 1 letter a day. She carved shapes out of dirt. Celis built crude wooden slates when he could, but mostly they worked with what they had: cloth remnants, broken clay, wooden boards heavy with hope. The children leaned in. They traced letters with trembling fingers. Some spelled their names backwards. Others doubted every stroke. But each attempt was a rebellion. Each shaky word they formed was proof they existed beyond the silence the world had cast upon them. Then came sentences. One little girl, her wrist marked by a faded scar, lifted the paper and read, "I am not afraid anymore." She didn't correct the punctuation, didn't redraw her crooked letters. She asked very gently, "Do you mean that?" The girl nodded. Livia tied the paper to a canvas post so the wind wouldn't carry it away. The next day, another child pinned up, "I know my name." Another wrote, "We are enough." And others followed. Silence is not shame. Kindness starts with knowing us. Each message was a small revolution, stitched together with trembling hands and fierce belief. Word spread quietly across the frontier. Villagers came, curious. Some skeptical that a tent could become a classroom. But soon, a mother with aching eyes asked, "Miss Liv, could you help me read my son's name?" An older man with sun-creased lines held out trembling hands, asking, "Could you teach me to write just so I can sign my name, right?" So Livia added evening lesson. Under lantern light, they circled up mothers, fathers, older girls, older boys holding pencils she collected, sharing scraps of paper she found. They traced letters by candlelight, sounding out words in hushed breaths. They learned together: home, water, mother, freedom. They learned each stroke meant identity, each sentence a small claim on dignity. In these twilight hours, Livia told stories, too quiet ones, about a girl once traded like possessions, who unearthed her voice in the space between silences, about a man who moved with gentleness not because he had to, but because he chose to. She never said, "That was me." She didn't need to. Her quiet presence said more than words. One day, a teacher from a settlement passed by, observed the makeshift classroom, inspected the slates scrawled with letters, the fragments pinned to the canvas walls. The teacher paused in silence, then said, softly, "You've built a classroom without walls, without maps." That night, she delivered a parcel: new notebooks, unused pencils, printed stories, and left without fanfare. No gratitude ceremonies, no public praise. Around the campfire that evening, Celis handed Livia a scrap of charcoal paper. "They call you Miss Liv now." That phrase weighed between them like a benediction. She nodded, patched a torn journal page, patched a missing word on a child's slate. No titles, no demands, just acceptance. On the final morning before they moved on, the children gathered to say goodbye, not songs, not formalities, but gifts, polished stones, feathers, broken shards they colored with their names in shaky letters. Each child laid their offering at her feet, eyes shining with gratitude and pride. Livia looked across at Silas, silent, solemn, present. He stood at the circle's edge, guardian but not instructor, unspoken anchor in their growing world. As the camp broke, she refused to take the lowest quality slates or the tattered pages. She left it all behind so someone else could use them, taking only her own patched journals full of names, stories, words just discovered. Before they left, a small boy tiptoed up and whispered, "Miss Liv, will you ever come back?" She knelt and wrote in the dirt, "I cannot promise, but I will not forget. M." Then she rose, brushed the dust from her skirts, and walked forward. In that ragged, borderless classroom with no maps, something extraordinary bloomed: a collective rebirth. Each child who learned to write their name, each adult who signed their first sentence, became a keeper of hope. And Livia realized that teaching others to say their names meant reclaiming her own. Here, in a small patch of dust and courage, she discovered that naming someone not for someone else, but for themselves, is the truest form of justice. Not long after they left, the classroom remained. Children kept returning, even to the emptiness sitting beside what used to be her tent, tracing letters into the dust as if her voice still echoed. One day, a traveler came by and saw the words, "I am still not afraid," written in the ground, faint but fresh. So the story of Miss Liv spread not just as myth or memory, but as example. In other settlements, people began gathering to teach their names, to pass down forgotten words, to write what had never been written, a ripple across silence. And still, Livia walked. With Celas beside her, they moved between towns, offering little, taking less, but always listening, always watching for another small corner where a voice had been buried. One evening, they came to a village by the river. No one spoke much. Eyes stayed down, but the local elder invited them to stay. She'd heard of the woman who taught without chalk. When Livia asked what the village needed, the woman pointed at her own granddaughter, barely 7, mute since birth, too scared to speak. "She cries in her sleep," the elder said, "but she never says a word." Livia knelt before the girl. Instead of asking anything, she simply handed her a piece of worn cloth and a piece of charcoal. The girl hesitated, then drew a shaky circle, then another. No one said it was beautiful. No one clapped. They just watched. By morning, The girl had drawn a tree. Underneath, she scribbled a word, safe. No one had taught her to spell it, but somehow she knew. And Livia knew then what she had started wasn't just a school or a movement or a memory. It was a permission, a quiet revolution that allowed people to believe, even for a moment, that they were allowed to take up space, to be heard, to exist. In towns where fear lingered, where people had been silenced or shamed, she helped them find not just their voices but the right to use them. Sometimes she taught for weeks, sometimes only a night. Sometimes she said goodbye knowing no one would remember her name, but someone always remembered the feeling, and that was enough. Silas once asked her, after one long evening, "Do you miss that first tent?" She thought about the scraps of paper, the girl with the scar, the boy who asked if he'd ever see her again, and then she smiled. Number. Because it's everywhere now. And he understood. The classroom had never been the tent. It had always been the space between silence and courage. The classroom was in every whispered name, every trembling hand drawing the first letter, every adult deciding to write again. It lived in corners, in firesides, in story circles, in broken barns turned sanctuary. It lived in people. When power came knocking again, a horizon of dust marked their arrival, wagons rolling forward like a judge's procession beneath the grim western sun. At the helm sat Lord Cassian, regal in his posture, eyes fixed and unyielding. Not a shout, not a plea. Just the authority of law and legacy, coming to reclaim what he believed was lost. He rode into camp just as Celis had finished repairing a broken slate, and Livia was gathering children to the edge of the tent for their lesson. The students froze, sticks poised mid-letter, as if the very air outside had smarted them into silence. From the edge of the wagon, his lawyer stepped down, scrolls trailing, deeds, contracts, legal jargon meant to entrap. He unrolled one before them, voice dry with authority. By birthright, Miss Cassian is to return to the estate. Livia stood firm, dust from her dress mingling with chalk on her fingers. She did not step backward. She did not shrink. Instead, she picked up a stick and etched a single word into the dirt. Freedom. F-R-E-E-D-O-M. The children echoed after her. The word took root in that moment, not spoken into fear, but carved into their presence. Lord Cassian cleared his throat. "You misunderstand your standing." She looked him in the eye. No fear, no apology. "I understand better than you." The lawyer stepped forward, raising the parchment like a weapon. She dismissed it with a gesture. "This is my truth now, not your legacy." He bristled. Celis moved quietly behind her, hand resting on her shoulder, steady, principled, silent support. Rosamond emerged from the back of the circle. Her voice, once hidden behind hallways, rang clear. "You cannot claim her now. She stood already under our roof, not yours." Silence fell. Livia knelt, touching dust with careful fingers, writing another word. Justice. "Spell it with me," she invited, and the children solemnly spelled it back. Juzing, seizing, not forgiveness, not mercy, just recognition. When the lawyer spoke again, demanding she return within a week, Lord Cassian wavered. He opened his mouth, perhaps to threaten, perhaps to plead, but stopped. The tent brimmed with expectation. Livia rose, straightened, walked toward the circle, turning her back to the wagons. Behind her stood Celis. In front of her, the children and villagers claiming new names, new sentences, new selves. She addressed the lawyer without turning around. "You may stay, observe, but you will not rewrite me." He stepped back, eyes flicking to Cassian for guidance. Cassian inhaled sharply, the weight of his own bloodline crumbling around him. He turned, climbed onto the wagon. As the horses strained to move forward, his gaze found Livia steady, honest, liberated. Her name hung between them, his daughter, not his possession. The camp breathed again. After sunset, flames flickered beside quiet faces. Livia sat by the embers, shoulder touching Celis's. No words, just presence. The children drew names in the cold. Mothers looked at their children with new pride. Men folded into quiet respect. That night, power came knocking and witnessed that it couldn't undo what had already happened, not the learning, not the teaching, not the resolve. Freedom wasn't granted, it was claimed. The next morning's sky was unforgivingly clear, the horizon wide, but the air carried a new heaviness. Lord Cashin's wagons were gone. The lawyers, the scrolls, the claims, they had vanished like smoke. Yet their presence lingered in the silence like a ghost unwilling to leave. Livia didn't stand at camp to mark their departure. Instead, she went to her students. She gathered them beneath the canvas, still warm from yesterday's lesson. They came silently, some curious, some cautious, some simply expecting her to carry them forward. She handed out scraps of cloth, charcoal sticks, old paper. "Today," she told them, "we write not just words but the story of who we choose to be." A boy, quiet since the confrontation, looked at her with bright eyes. He wrote slowly, "No one owns me." Another scrawled, "I decide my name." She recognized the echo of her own first scribbled declarations in their shaky letters. Every child's voice rose like tide. Their adults stood behind, learning not just to read but to witness, to unlearn what they'd been taught. That day, the camp felt consecrated not by formal boundaries, but by the act of choosing dignity. Inside that classroom, Silas worked near the edges, repairing boards, sealing cracks in the canvas, carving new slates. Once, he offered her a fresh piece of wood, smooth, unmarked. She held it like a vow. They didn't speak, but sometimes a small offering says more. A vow does not need lips to be shared, it only needs hands that hold tight. That evening, the old teacher who had come once before returned. She watched from afar, observing the words taped to posts, the faces bright with understanding, the rhythm of lessons flowing like water, children teaching younger siblings, parents tracing names under candlelight. Even the girl who once stuttered at letters now read aloud a short sentence, "I belong here." The teacher approached Livia later and placed a folded piece of parchment in her hand. On it, two simple words in elegant script, "Well done." No signatures, no titles, just recognition handed quietly enough to remind Livia that justice ripples when it's given. That camp became something else. Not a temporary tent, not a lesson site, but a memory of what happens when voiceless people speak, when children repeat love, when a person dares to teach even after someone else tried to erase her. When Celis finally spoke, it was just one sentence as they packed to leave. She believed she could write herself into the world. I helped her hold the pencil. Livia's hand closed around his. No declaration, no request, just quiet agreement. As they walked away from that patch of frontier earth, she glanced back at the fading silhouette of the camp. The children still traced letters in the dust. The walls of scraps fluttered in wind. The embers cooled, but the sparks of identity still glowed. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "Continue." What she gave them wasn't just word. By the time the wildflowers bloomed again, word of Miss Liv's camp had traveled far over hills, across creeks, through whispers on front porches and market stalls. They called it the place where silence ends. Not a school, not a church. Something in between. A place where letters became more than letters. Where names became anchors. People arrived with questions, but stayed for the certainty in their own voices. A father who never learned to read now copied every line his daughter whispered. A teenager who once threw stones at the weird letter camp now sat in the corner writing poems about horses and mothers. They didn't call it magic, but they treated it like something holy. One morning, a small boy came running with a torn envelope in hand, tears already on his cheeks. He pointed at the name at the top. "Mariana, that's my mama," he whispered. "I can read her name." He didn't need to say more. The tears did the rest. That afternoon, every child practiced writing someone they loved. They filled pages with names of the lost, the hurt, the long forgotten, and for a moment, those names lived again. A week later, a young mother, quiet and shaking, entered the classroom with a government form in her hand. "They said I have to sign it," she murmured, "for my baby's name. But I I never knew how. Livia smiled, took her hand, and guided her through each letter. Sarah. A name, a future, a legacy written by the very hand that birthed it. Afterward, the mother hugged her daughter tightly and whispered, "I did that. I gave you your name." And for the first time, it felt true. Outside the camp, people still gossiped, still called her that strange woman with books. But fewer and fewer used the phrase, the fat girl her father gave away. It no longer held meaning. It no longer held power. Instead, they called her the woman who taught children to speak their worth. A local merchant painted a sign for her, Liv's letters, and hung it not above her tent, but on the tree where she first sat to teach the alphabet in dirt. People began to bring offerings, not money, but bread, blankets, old books. One even carved her a stool from cedar. She didn't need praise. But something about these small kindnesses softened the part of her still healing. Celis watched it all with quiet pride. He never taught in her class, but he fixed the hinges, chopped the firewood, brought the children water. Sometimes he stood outside and just listened, like the hum of voices learning to speak was music meant only for him. One day, a girl asked Livia, "Why do we learn names first?" She paused, wiped chalk dust from her hands, and knelt beside her. "Because no one can take you away from yourself," she answered. "Not if you know who you are." The girl smiled, then turned to the slate and wrote, "I am Ruth." Not just a name, a declaration. At night, they lit small fires and told stories about women who grew strong, about men who listened, about children who wrote new endings. Around those fires, no one was a slave. No one was forgotten. Everyone was becoming. And that was the legacy. Livia never published a book. She never stood in a courthouse or became anyone's wife. But in every child who traced a name with certainty, in every woman who filled out a birth record or land deed, her presence endured. She had built a frontier of the soul, a space where the discarded learned to rise, not because someone lifted them, but because they were finally seen, named, and heard. She had given them something that outlived her, not just words, but the right to speak them. The day she didn't need to be saved. A traveler came through the settlement, one of many drawn by whispers of a woman who taught names, who made dignity grow from dust. He sat beneath the canvas roof as class ended, watching children roll up their slates and adults pack away worn books like precious heirlooms. After a long pause, he turned to Livia, eyes narrowed not in judgment, but genuine wonder. "So, he saved you?" he asked, tilting his chin toward Celis, who stood near the water barrel, wiping dust from his hands. She looked at the man, then at Celis. "No," she said softly. "He stayed, while I saved myself." The traveler blinked, perhaps expecting something more heroic, more dramatic. But there was no music in the air, no swelling sunset behind her. Just honesty, just stillness. Celis didn't hear the words. Or maybe he did. He didn't react. He kept stacking firewood. That was his way, present, never performative. Later that day, Livia sat with a girl named Marisol who was struggling to form her R. The letter wobbled like a cartwheel in sand. "You're pressing too hard," Livia said. "Let the letter come, don't force it." The girl tried again, gentler this time. The curve found its shape. The name became real. "You did it," Livia smiled. The child looked up. "You helped." "No," Livia whispered. "You were always going to get there. I just waited with you." She walked home beneath a sky smeared with lavender and ash. The wind didn't carry noise that evening, just warmth. As she approached their small home, she saw Celis fixing the fence again. She didn't rush. She didn't call out. She simply walked until they stood side by side. They didn't need to fill the silence. The day had said enough. That night, around a dim fire, she told a story not about herself, but about a tree. There was a seed, she said, that grew in hard soil. The ground didn't want it. Stones pushed at its roots, sun seared its leaves. But it didn't ask the wind to lift it. It just grew, quietly, relentlessly. A boy asked, "Did the tree survive?" Livia smiled. It became the place where others came to rest. There was a time when she thought love was what rescued you, what lifted you from the pit. Now she knew better. Love was what watched while you climbed, held the rope without pulling, lit the lantern but never told you where to go. Celis wasn't her rescuer. She wasn't a girl in chains. They were simply two people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. She once thought a voice had to be loud to be heard. Now, every morning, she heard it in the scrape of chalk, in the hush of children reading aloud, in the steady rhythm of her own breath as she wrote letters on slates handed to trembling hands. When a new student asked her why she never raised her voice, she answered, "Because I never needed to shout. I just needed to mean it." And so, the story that once began in shame ended in choice. Not the kind written in contracts or dictated by blood, but the kind lived in ordinary moments, made sacred by patience. On the last day of autumn, a girl named Eliza brought Livia a faded photograph. It wasn't hers. It had been found between the pages of an old Bible someone donated to the school. The image showed a woman in a plain dress, unsmiling, holding a baby wrapped in coarse cloth. Eliza asked, "Do you think she ever learned to write?" Livia took the photo gently, her thumb tracing the corner. "Maybe not with letters," she said, "but holding that child, that was a sentence." The girl didn't quite understand, but someday she would, just like Livia had. Because not every story is told with words. Some are lived in choices too quiet to echo, too deep to fade. That evening, she and Celis sat beneath the tree they'd planted 2 years before the one from the discarded seedling found behind a trader's cart. It had grown crooked at first, but stubbornly, it climbed toward light. Now, small birds nested in its branches. He asked her if she missed the world outside the city, the titles, the rooms with carved ceilings and chairs too delicate to sit in. She laughed softly. "I used to think I was born for that world. Now I think I was born to unlearn it." He didn't respond, just watched the sky shift from rose to ash. Then, without warning, she said, "If I died tomorrow, would they remember me?" "You?" he replied. "They'd spell your name in stars." She shook her head, smiling. "Number they'll remember themselves. Because of what they wrote here. Because of what they chose to believe." She turned to him. "That's better, don't you think? Being the reason someone else remembers who they are." He nodded. In the distance, laughter echoed from the tents. Someone burned bread. A child shouted the wrong answer with such confidence it made the others erupt with joy. Nothing was polished. Nothing was perfect, but everything mattered. She leaned back on her hands, staring up through the branches. "No one ever saved me," she whispered. He glanced at her, not with concern, but in agreement. "And yet," she added, "I was never alone." They sat until the stars came out, until the wind picked up and the air smelled like wood smoke and possibility. They didn't hold hands. They didn't make vows. They just stayed. And sometimes, that's all the ending a story needs. Not a wedding, not a war. Just a girl who learned her name and a man who knew never to take it from her. Her name was not lost. In the soft soil behind the camp, where the grasses grew just tall enough to whisper, there stood a small stone, no border, no flowers pressed into marble, just a line of words, carved not to impress, but to remember. Livia. She taught names. No statue was built. No painting hung in town halls. No songs were written with her name in the chorus. And yet, in ways quieter than wind and more enduring than bronze, she lived on. Each time a child stood up and said not, "I'm nobody," but "I am Ruth," or "I am Samuel," or "I am mine," a thread of her voice wove through the room. When a mother signed her name for the first time, or an old man traced the letters of his long-dead wife into the dirt just to see them one more time, her hands were there, not as ghost, not as legend, but as permission. Permission to belong, to speak, to choose. Long after the tent had faded and the tree grown wide, long after her hands had stilled and the children she taught became teachers themselves, her gift remained. Not because she shouted, but because she waited. Not because she rescued, but because she stayed. Some lives end with applause, some with silence. Hers ended in the rustle of pages turned by trembling hands, in chalk dust rising from slates held tightly, in the smallest breath before a name is spoken aloud for the first time. And in that pause between silence and voice she still exists,